Welcome back to another talk about Stoicism. We're going over the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. We are in Book 11, and I want to talk about Section 8, which I always find a surprisingly touching section, if nothing else than just because of the almost poetic nature that Marcus Aurelius uses to describe this. Section 8. A branch cut from its neighboring branch is necessarily cut away from the whole tree. In the same way, a human being severed from just one other human has dropped from the whole community. Now the branch is cut off by someone else, but a man separates himself from his neighbor by his own hatred or rejection, not realizing that he has thereby severed himself from the wider society of fellow citizens. Only there is this gift we have from Zeus, who brought together the human community. We can grow back again to our neighbor and resume our place in the complement of the whole. Too often repeated, though, such separation makes it harder to unite and restore the divided part. In sum, the branch which stays with the tree from the beginning of its growth and shares its transpiration is not the same as the branch which is cut off and then regrafted, whatever the gardeners say. Share their stock, but not their doctrines. Well, there's a lot to say there. Let's start somewhere. I think that often we are able to cut ourselves off either through our behavior or what we say, or sometimes just our thoughts from other people, from those we love. And that is largely, I think, a part of the human condition. We can become angry, we can say things, and then we can kind of become isolated. How many times have you said something to someone you loved, knowing full well that you didn't really want to say that you didn't really mean it, but you just said it because you were angry, you were upset. And then you cut yourself off, and it hurts. And you cut off the other person, and that hurts. And that's a difficult thing to deal with. But at the end of the day, we are part of the same tree. We're all part of the same species. And it is important to stick together within reason, of course. I mean, because this is always the moment then someone says, but what about terrible murderers? I understand that there can be people who've committed terrible crimes, right? But I'm in these videos, I want to focus not necessarily on extreme cases, but on everyday life and everyday things that happen to us. And in everyday life, I think this is, I don't necessarily want to say a common thing, but it is a thing that happens, that we, again, say or do or even think things that can cut us off from others. And when that happens, well, that's a sad thing, because we become isolated. I watched a while ago a documentary on flat earthers, and I like to think of myself as a scientist, someone who is trained in science. I did the work for the PhD, all that kind of stuff. And I sat there looking at all the people who believe that the earth is flat, ignoring centuries of scientific observation, ignoring pictures taken from space, ignoring basic mathematical principles, and who apparently seem to have an answer for everything, why all that is wrong. They even did experiments to prove that the earth was flat, and of course every time the experiments fail, because the earth is not flat, so their experiments fail, and instead of accepting that they were wrong and that the earth is not flat, the conclusion every time was, well, the experiment was flawed. We need to do a better experiment. And once we've done the perfect experiment, then we will show that the earth is actually flat. And again, I sat there with increasing, I don't know if discomfort is the word, or annoyance, or incredulity, maybe disbelief, thinking, how you just ran the experiment. It shows you your hypothesis was wrong. It ends there. It's over. Every experiment you've done has shown that you were wrong. And yet you keep clinging to this idea that is obviously wrong. It's more or less how I sat there, shouting at my screen. But then something interesting happened. In the documentary, they showed a little bit of a sort of a, it wasn't a scientific conference, more like a little symposium or something. And they were discussing flat earthers and flat earth theories and that kind of stuff. And there was an actual scientist there who completely changed my perspective. Because he raised the point of the people who believe these kinds of theories are people who are basically a lost opportunity. And we as a scientific community have failed these people by not educating them properly. And a specific example that really appealed to me, because I mean I teach for a living, was if you are teaching something and your students don't understand it, and then you blame your students for not understanding that material, then what are you doing? Maybe you should blame yourself. Provided that they're putting in the work, how could you say, well, it's your fault for not understanding this? I mean, I explained it, so. I wouldn't be able to do that. I couldn't do that in my job, right? So then look at these people who believe in a theory that is false, right? And think, maybe we failed them. Now, why am I bringing up this extensive illustration? Because I think here you see the effects of cutting off that limb of a tree. Because these people become more and more isolated. Because they form groups, and in those groups become splinter factions, and these groups believe that they understand science better than scientists, understand physics better than physicists, for example. And then they start to run experiments, which in themselves are good experiments. Many of those were really good experiments, but then the experiments didn't show what the people thought they were going to find, and then they were unable to take the last step in good science, which is saying, I ran the experiment. It's a solid experiment. I didn't find what I wanted to find or what I thought I would find. The hypothesis must have been wrong. And then they come up with a follow-up experiment and a follow-up experiment. And every time they become more insulated from the other people in the world who are convinced, justly so, that the world is actually a sphere and not a flat surface. But then, think about the implications. Now, I'm not saying that we now all need to go to a flat earth society and start to explain. That's not what I'm saying. But think about what it means. What it would feel like to not only be cut off from, and I use this term with much reservation, but quote-unquote, the mainstream. And then you have all these people who, instead of talking to you and saying, you know what, have you considered this, that, and the other? And sometimes these people have been told all those things and they still don't believe it. Okay. But what's interesting is people now look down on you and they think that you are some sort of outcast, right? And then you become an outcast. And then you are no longer part of the mainstream. And again, with reservation. I'm not saying everybody wants to be part of the mainstream. I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing to be part of the mainstream, but I hope that you would agree with me that we can all be really certain that the world is not flat, right? And then that branch of you is cut off. and the branch falls away from the tree. And even if that branch is taken up and grafted back upon the tree, I particularly enjoy that, it will never be the same again. It'll forever be altered and scarred. So I think looking at things from that perspective, the importance of sticking together, especially in difficult times. Right now, we're in a coronavirus pandemic. These are difficult times. And the more we polarize, the more we move away from each other, the harder it becomes to get people back together. And that's, in my mind, in many ways, a pretty scary thought. So, we try to stick together. I hope this was useful. Just some thoughts. Let me know what you think about this particular section. I don't want to say it. Hashtag flat earth. About this section, what do you think? I'll see you next week for more talk about Stoicism.